So today what we're doing is that we are simplifying a radical form. So if you have no idea what radical form is and how to even simplify it, this is the right video for you. So first of all, before we get started, let me briefly define radical form. So radical form is something like square root 32. Oops. It can also be square root 2, square root 9, square root 255. Like any number, as long as there's a number inside the square root, that is called a radical form. Now, let's say we have square root 3, and now this is a radical form. But if there's a number outside of the square root 3, which is 2, and by the way, when you see something like this, it just means that 2 is multiplying square root 3. And so when you see something like this is called the simplest radical form. And so our goal today is to turn this square root 32 into something that looks like this because this is the simplest radical form. Of course, if you have like a 4 here, you can simplify the 4 into 2, and so it just means that it is 2 times 2. But for most of the time, when you have a number and like this is called the simplest radical form. So the first step we want to do when simplifying the radical form is that we want to find two numbers. Let me just name them x and y. So we want to find two numbers that multiply each other to get 32. And so for now, you don't have to worry too much about the square roots here because both sides, this side and this side, also have the square roots. So you just want to know x and y that multiply each other to get 32. And so here, I want to tell you that one of these numbers, the x or the y, one of them definitely has to be from this column here. So I have here made a list of all the numbers that multiply each other to get 32. And the first one here, 1 times 32, well, I can eliminate that because 1 times 32 is 32. I mean, that does work, but 1 is not from this column here. It's not from this column, and 32 is also not from this column here. And so we can eliminate that. And now we have these two choices here, either 2 times 16 or 4 times 8. Now these two both work because 16 can be found here and 4 can be found here. Now of course, when you simplify a radical, you don't always have to use my method to list all the perfect squares here, but you just want to, in your mind, think about a number that when it is square root is equal to a whole number. So just in your mind, think about that, and you don't always have to use my method like this. But for now, I just want to briefly explain it. So that's why I'm just listing all the perfect squares. Well, not all, but most of the perfect squares. So first of all, I'm going to use the first method, and then I'm going to use this method. So we have 2 times 16. So let's say x is 2. 2 times square root 16 is equal to 32. Now what we want to avoid here is multiplying these two together, because if you multiply each other, you get 32, and that's equal to square root 32, and that's definitely not helping us simplifying the radicals. And so the first thing we want to do is just focus on square root 2, and then we can focus on square root 16. So in square root 2, do you think we can simplify it? Well, no. Well, if we simplify it, it's going to get a decimal, and that's not like if we square root 2, it's going to be a decimal, and that's something that we don't want to do because decimals always complicate things so much further. So we can just write it out as square root 2 times, now this time square root 16, we can simplify that because if you take a look at the column here, square root 16 is the same as 4, which is true because 4 times 4 is 16. So you can write it out as just 4 is equal to 32. And now, as I said before, we can put it in a more formal way. We can do it square root 2 times 4. And that's equal to 32. And now we can't further simplify because 2 can't further simplify, and also 4 is a whole number and you don't need to further simplify that. And now, as I promised, I will do this method as well. So we have square root 4 times square root 8 is equal to square root 32. Now, can we simplify 4? Yes, because 2 times 2 is 4, so I can just write it out as 2 times, well, square root 8 there's no number in this column we can't see is square root 8. However, we can do 4 times 2. So 4 times 2 is equal to 8. And so now we can just focus on this and simplify it. So we have again 4 here, and square root 4 is the same as 2 because 2 times 2 is 4. So I can write it out as 2 times 2. And now square root 2, can we simplify it? No, we can't further simplify it. So I'm just going to write it out as square root 2. And that's equal to square root 32. And now again, I simplified this by multiplying 2 times 2 together, and I get 4. And so 4 times square root 2, well, now we can't further simplify it, and so this is the simplest radical form. And if you compare these two here, well, they both do work, but however, in this method here, you can see that when you choose the 8, you have to simplify into 4 times 2, and that takes a little longer than this method here. So whenever you have two possible methods to choose, I would recommend you to always choose the number that is the biggest.